I'd like to say to all of the young innovators,
Black Lives Matter.
Could nonviolent action be used against ISIS?
You
Even
can
the
be
flutter
a
of
part
my false
of the
eyelashes
biggest
could
scientific discoveries of our time.
Words matter. And the word revolution, it's a big one. And it's a significant word because it means different things to different people. And it's kind of a flexible, Gumby-like word that gets stretched into a variety of contexts. And I remember the first time I encountered that word, I was 19. It was 1989. I was kind of fresh out of high school. My big personal revolution was I started reading the newspaper. And I saw that December the word revolution, and then I saw Romania. And at that time in my life, I knew nothing about Romania except that it was locked behind the Iron Curtain. But as I started reading those news reports that came trickling and then flooding in, the unthinkable was happening in Romania, a revolution. And the communist ruler Ceausescu and his wife were executed in a very swift and forceful revolution. A few years ago, I went to northeast Romania, to the town of Timișoara, where the revolution started, because I wanted to know more about this. How did this start? Why did it start? And I met a woman there, and her name was Andreea, and she remembered very well the events of 1989. She was 13 years old at that time, and she said to me, Gina, if you want to understand why this happened, you've got to know what it was like to be a Romanian. She said there were food shortages, and people were literally starving to death. There was no electricity in the wintertime. People were freezing to death. People were taxed well beyond their means. There was no freedom of press. Something like what we're doing here today, this free exchange of ideas, would have never been allowed. People who had any kind of religious inclination and wanted to meet for religious purposes would have been hauled off to prison and beaten with incredible brutality. And yet, in the midst of this incredible and utterly repressive regime, a lone voice of protest rose up. And it was that of Reverend Tokash, a Reformed Lutheran pastor living in northeastern Romania. And he didn't call people to violence. He didn't call people to arms. He simply preached. And over the course of a series of Sundays, he delivered some homilies in which he suggested all people have basic rights to freedom. And his words were like embers that were sort of smoldering very quietly. And then very suddenly, those embers ignited into a flame. And people from all parts of Romania started gathering together in the city squares to protest. And Andreea recounted to me the events of one such protest. She was with her grandmother, and there were thousands upon thousands of people on their knees with candles in their hands, and they were praying. And at one point, she said she looked up and she noticed they were utterly surrounded by soldiers with machine guns pointed at them. And then the order from Ceausescu came, fire on the civilians. And then she said, this is where something truly miraculous happened. The soldiers looked at each other, they looked at the civilians, they looked at each other, and they put their weapons down. And that was the end of the Ceausescu regime. Yeah. This is a wonderful example of a somewhat ordinary person using his words to an extraordinary effect. But it wasn't an isolated incident. As World War II was concluding and treaties were being made and boundaries being redrawn, the Soviet Union emerged as a very clear and powerful European superpower. And as is the case with such superpowers, they began annexing and occupying territories of adjacent countries that sat near its borders. And any of these other countries that tried to protest or put up any kind of resistance were very handily put down. And such was the case in Czechoslovakia. And the Czech citizens knew as those tanks came rolling in that they were absolutely out-resourced, outnumbered. They really couldn't count on Western support. Creative protest was really all they had. And so that's what they used. As those tanks came rolling in, they removed identifying marks from buildings. They reversed street signs. They pretended not to speak Russian. If and when they were protesting, nonviolent protesting, and they saw that they were surrounded by soldiers with machine guns, they would put roses or carnations into the muzzles of those guns. And in one particular instance, in downtown Prague, the tanks were assembling, and a bunch of young women got together, and they decided, you know what? We're going to dance in front of those tanks, and we're going to do this as seductively as possible. we're going to do this without any clothes on. I don't have a slide for that one. But you can just imagine the effect that dancing had on those 18 and 19-year-old tank drivers. Those tanks came to a dead standstill. And while this was all happening above ground, underground, writers and artists and poets and playwrights were churning out an impressive body of anti-Soviet pro-freedom work. And over time, all of this nonviolent protest had an accumulative effect. In 1989, the Velvet Revolution occurred. After a series of sustained, prolonged, nonviolent protests, the Soviet Union entirely withdrew its militarized presence out of Czechoslovakia. And the last thing that those tank drivers heard as they were driving out and heading back toward Moscow was the jingling of thousands upon thousands of keys. Just imagine that sound. All of these keys jingling, all of these people saying, all of the doors that had been closed to us for so many years now are flung wide open. And it was the sound of a united citizenry saying, goodbye, it's time for you to go home. Now, 1989 was a really big year for revolution. While all these things were happening in Czechoslovakia, the people in the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania likewise wanted to call attention to their plight. They, too, had been illegally occupied. And so in August of 1989, 2 million people, that is, 1 out of every 3rd person in the population, gathered together and formed a human chain stretching from the capital of Estonia all the way down to the capital of Lithuania. That's about 420 miles. And they held hands and they sang. They were singing the old traditional poem songs called Dainas. And as you came in today, you got one, I hope. You may have gotten one in your bag. If you didn't get one in your bag, maybe your neighbor got one. But anyways, these were the songs that they were singing as they were holding hands, because during the Soviet occupation, they weren't allowed to sing them. And these songs are the lifeblood for the Latvians and the Lithuanians in particular. These are the songs that tell them what it means to be a Balt. These are the songs that tell them how to live, what they believe in, and why they believe in it. And so as they were holding hands, yes, they were protesting the Soviet occupation, but they were also saying, you may occupy our country, but you can never occupy our minds or our hearts. So I wanted to find out more about these poem songs, why they were so powerful as a form of protest. So I went to Latvia, and on one of those trips, I had the great opportunity to meet Knuts Skujenieks. And Knuts knew intimately what it meant to be a poet in Soviet Latvia. In 1962, he was accused of anti-Soviet crimes. His big offense was he had a single volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica on his bookshelf. And for that, they sent him for 7 years to a Gulag work camp. And this is a camp in which prisoners are basically worked to death. And I asked him, because I knew so few people survive a Gulag, I asked him, Knuts, how did you survive this? And he smiled, a huge, beatific smile, and he said, poetry. Poetry saved my life. I wrote 2 poems a day, and I smuggled them out. And I told jokes, because they can't abide a sense of humor. And this is why they thought he was a dangerous man. He wrote poems and he told jokes. And later as I left and I was remembering the other parts of his story that he told, the great injustices, the cruelty, the brutality, when he told his story, there was not an ounce of bitterness, not an ounce of rancor or hatred. He didn't hate people. He hated systems that sought to crush human imagination and thought. He hated the absurd Soviet rhetoric, but he didn't hate people, and that was his strength. Of what relevance do these stories happening in faraway places have for someone like me? I am not an important political activist. I have written a total sum of 0 poems. I have no plans to dance nude in front of a tank. I teach creative writing. The most daring thing I might do in a day is decide whether or not to take out a comma or put another one in. Yeah. I tell stories. But that means daily then I have choices. How will I talk to students and colleagues and the gas attendant and the cashier at the grocery store? Am I using my language as a way of building bridges or erecting fences? And I'm beginning to think that this whole building bridge thing, it has as much to do with listening as it does with talking. I'm beginning to think, I know it's a skill I need to work on, but I'm beginning to wonder if listening then isn't in itself a revolutionary act, or perhaps talking less. This will be more popular with some folks, less so with others, but it seems to me the point is our words are so precious, we cannot scatter them thoughtlessly to the wind and just hope something happens with them, or worse, not care if it doesn't. In June of 2015, for reasons I really still can't explain, not to my parents or anyone else, I found myself in the capital city of Bosnia, Sarajevo. And I had some free time on my hands, so I signed up for one of those free city walking tours in which someone would point out all of the great, historical monuments and churches and whatnot. And our guide's name was Enes, and he took us down some of the streets, and he pointed out the major sites, but he really wanted us to understand that Bosnia was a very rich country. It was more than just a war zone. Bosnia represented the meeting between the East and the West, and for hundreds upon hundreds of years, people had been living side by side, people of all walks of life, all different ethnic backgrounds, religious beliefs, had been living and working together peaceably side by side. But as we were walking down the streets, it was hard not to notice all the bullet holes in the buildings and the mortar, places where the mortar rounds had exploded in the concrete. And as we were walking, we were noticing these stains on the sidewalk. And at one point he stopped and he said, yes, we call those roses. That's all that's left of the victims of the Serbian snipers. And then he went on to tell us his story. When the siege of '92 happened in Sarajevo, he was 8 years old. And the siege was so complete that there was no food in the city, and people were starving. They were burning their books, some of them burning holy books, just to stay warm in the winter. But being a kid, he went outside, and he was just kicking the soccer ball around with his friend, and then suddenly his friend is down in a pool of blood. And somebody in the group said, do you hate the Serbs? And he was quick to say, no, I do not hate the Serbs. I don't hate the Croats, the Bosniaks, the Serbs. I don't hate anybody. I will call you my friend if you don't do or say hateful things. I don't care who you are, what you believe in, what your political or religious stance is. If you don't act in a hateful manner, I will call you my friend. And he said, as he pointed to those stains on the sidewalk, he said, friends, we were meant for something more than this. And then he said very quietly, we have to do better than this. And I thought, whoa. Wait a minute, this is not your standard tour guide script. And why is he telling us this when clearly it is so painful for him to share the story? And I realized it's because he's sharing his story, and he understands that every time he takes a tour group out, he has the opportunity to change his world one story at a time. This is his way of brokering reconciliation and healing. And as I think about Enes, and I think there are a lot of Eneses in our world, this is truly an extraordinary, revolutionary act. And I'm left with a singular idea. We all have it within us to broker reconciliation, to bring about healing, to use our stories in a revolutionary manner. I'd like to close with the words of the great Oregon writer Brian Doyle, as recently quoted in the Oregonian. He said, we can change the world. We can change the world if we tell the right story. Thank you.